So yeah, thanks again. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you all this evening. Yeah, what I want to talk about is this emerging discussion in public debates, media debates, and academia as well about transitions. Low carbon energy transitions are often talked about, but of course more broadly sustainability transitions. But what I want to suggest is that I think the way we're talking about it is limited and flawed in lots of ways, and that actually what we really need, if we're serious about tackling the climate and ecological emergency that we now face, that we need to think much more seriously about deeper transformations, which really get at the root of some of the problems that we're facing. And so let me just sort of talk you through what I mean by that. So you've probably all heard of this thing called the Anthropocene. There's ongoing discussion. I mean, a geologist panel recently said they thought that there wasn't a need to redefine this particular epoch, but many people have said for a while now that the primary drivers of humanity's overall condition are humans for a whole set of reasons that I'll go into at the moment. So we hear a lot about this phrase, the Anthropocene, which means that we're driving past many of these so-called planetary boundaries. So again, I won't talk about all of these, but you can see in many key areas we're well past the safe zone. So the safe zone being the green bit in the middle that you can see on this slide. And around climate, around land use change, biodiversity, very bad indeed. But geochemical flows. I mean, across many of the key thresholds, if you like, that we depend on for a safe existence, are being surpassed at an accelerating rate in many cases. And so this is what we mean by planetary boundaries. So a lot of discussions are really about take their reference from this need to try and live within planetary boundaries. And you might have come across Kate Raworth and people like that talking about a safe and just operating space for humanity, which means living within these boundaries, within these limits, but in a way that deals with everyone's developmental needs. So how did we get there? Of course, views are very divided about the basis of this, of the problem of this overshoot and this unsustainable economic system that we have. Some people lay the blame at colonialism, histories of colonialism, and of course, that's been a live debate today about reparations at the summit in Samoa that Sakia Starmer and King Charles and others are attending. And clearly, that's part of the story. There's been this unsustainable extraction of wealth from poorer parts of the world, which has allowed for huge overconsumption, unsustainable levels of consumption in the global north. And that's obviously an historical phenomena, but it continues in many ways today. So that's clearly part of the story. But academics and scientists in particular have also talked about what's called the Great Acceleration, which was really this massive uptick. And you can see across most of these areas, whether it's sort of population, primary energy use, water use, paper production, fertilizer consumption, all of these things in that sort of, particularly in that post-Second World War period, show a major uptick. This was this huge scaling up and intensification of the use of fossil fuels and extending production chains over longer distances, intensifying industrial agriculture, etc., which again have led to the sort of predicaments that we're facing today. But there are, of course, different ideas about what are the underlying causes of the problems that we're now facing, and therefore what should be the most appropriate solutions. Now, Bill Gates and many people like him, you can see Nick Stern on the right of the screen here as well, have a particular idea about what the problem is and how it should be fixed. For Bill Gates, it's very much around markets, that if we price things properly, things like carbon, we can fix this without the need for broader systemic political reforms of one sort or another, and certainly not shifting patterns of production and consumption, but puts a huge faith in business and in technological fixes, particularly. So if any of you've had a chance to read his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, that's essentially what it's about. It's about big breakthrough technologies that he is confident will save the day. Nick Stern, a little bit more conservative perhaps, but still very much putting the emphasis on market fixes. His Stern Review, written in, I think it was 2007, 2008 now, talked about climate change being the greatest market failure the world had ever faced. And therefore the way to fix it was to price carbon properly, essentially, and that would send the right incentives through the economy to deal with the issue properly. And we're seeing more and more governments, obviously, they have to do this as part of the climate negotiations, but more broadly, talking about transitions and the things that they think will deliver them. And you can see on the left-hand side, or my left-hand side of the screen, there are some of the key enablers that underpin shifts towards lower carbon and more generally more sustainable economies. And that's partly around trying to secure comparative advantage. We're seeing this obviously with the new Labour government talking about a global clean power alliance, for example, lower carbon infrastructures, investment, behaviour change, leadership skills, etc. Doing that through these key sectors, which, given the nature of climate change, but more broadly, means you have to tackle waste and transport and energy, land and agriculture simultaneously as a means of creating opportunities. So this is quite a dominant discourse around the need to shift the ways in which we provide key services. And it underpins ideas about green growth and the green economy. That by tweaking these things, each of these things along the left-hand side, the enablers, whether it's nudging people to behave differently, redirecting investment towards greener sectors, shifting infrastructures, these things will be sufficient to deal with the nature of the challenge that we're up against. And you see this in various, what I'm calling in this slide, imaginaries of the green economy. Around creating green jobs, more sustainable jobs, more resilient lives, healthier lives, trying to integrate human well-being. There's lots of different depictions of what the key elements of a green economy are. But as we know in contemporary debate, and this is very much the discourse of the new government, it's around reconciling the need to transition and to tackle environmental problems with the absolute unquestionable imperative of economic growth as far as most people are concerned. And in academic debates, people often talk about transitions in this term. So this is a bit of a messy diagram, but let me just briefly try and explain it. What it's trying to show is that we have these dominant regimes around transport, around food, around water, around energy, which is like the dominant way of providing things. So automobility fueled by fossil fuels would be an example of that. And that if you're going to shift that and break out of that and move beyond that, you need to see both support to what are called niches at the bottom of the diagram there. So you give more support to renewable energy providers, for example, but that their chances of succeeding and disrupting this dominant way of providing services is also dependent on this top part, what's called landscape pressures. And that can be a whole range of things, from sort of prices, shifts in population, cultural shifts, but they bear down upon and disrupt this dominant regime in ways that allow other technological pathways and alternatives to flourish. My concern with this is what I've called it a plug and play approach to transition. Basically, you say, instead of dealing with the problem of automobility, we'll just go for electric cars. Okay. So rather than invest properly in public transport or more active forms of travel, the solution, as we're often hearing, is just to sort of replace one set of cars with another set of cars. And this is what I mean by a plug and play approach. So you're not questioning patterns of ownership or overall levels of production and consumption, let alone the power relations around them. It's really just about changing the technology or changing the energy source, but otherwise carrying on as usual. So that's a sort of what I've painted so far is a very conventional account of what we mean by transition and who and what should be transitioned and towards what end, which is essentially around tweaking markets, enabling new forms of technology towards green growth. Now, what I want to suggest is take us in a slightly different direction now, is that we also need to address questions of power and inequality. And I want to suggest that for a whole series of reasons. One is around inequalities in emissions and in responsibility for the problems that we're talking about here, whether it's the biodiversity crisis or climate change, water contamination, whatever it might be. We can see massive inequalities in terms of responsibility and overuse of resources. I'm not going to go through all of those stats on the right there, but we did some work a few years ago on behavior change, and it was really trying to sort of move beyond this notion of we're all in it together and nudging everyone to do their bit, when actually there are, higher segments of the population, so 10% globally, but 1% in many richer parts of the country that are disproportionately responsible for very, very high levels of emissions. So you can see, some of the stats there. This is from the UN emissions gap report from a few years ago. And so, one of the key findings from our work back then was the need to address what we called the polluter elite. Okay, so it can't just be around saying, pressuring everyone to lower their carbon footprint if you're not going to at the same time think seriously about retrofitting houses and making public transport more affordable, and actually doing something about richer people's consumption. So you might have to think about taxes on aviation or limits on the size of houses. You may have to think about what's sometimes called choice editing, which is stopping highly polluting carbon intensive products like SUVs or private jets from coming to market in the first place. So it's a more difficult and bolder set of interventions than we've been willing to consider so far, where the emphasis has been much more on nudging and trying to improve, recycling rates, or getting more people to buy EV cars, etc. And so this is what we mean by the polluter elite, but it's not just about lifestyles and emissions. It's obviously also about party donations, the control that many polluting companies have over our politics, not just the party donations, but also, of course, secondments, revolving doors, which we've seen particularly under the Conservatives, but we're starting to see emerging evidence of it, unfortunately, also under Labour, getting access to key committees and having disproportionate influence over key decisions. But it's also the financial power of polluter elites in terms of the stocks and the shares or the companies they may own, which continue to, for the most part, invest in highly polluting sectors. So what I'm pushing for here is a slightly clearer account of agency and responsibility, which then informs discussions around what we can do about it. And those inequalities obviously exist within countries, within our own country, obviously, but also between societies, very much so. So some environmentalists talk about ecologically uneven exchange, which is about that unfair and uneven extraction of water, of land, of energy from poorer parts of the world to fuel overconsumption in richer parts of the world. So that the extreme inequality and overconsumption, as this graphic shows, often go together. And inequality is not just a problem for sustainability. Many of you might have heard of this book. It came out quite a few years ago now, but it's quite popular, called The Spirit Level. And it sort of shows how across any issue area you choose to name, whether it's addiction, drug abuse, suicide levels, ill health, they're quite closely correlated with levels of inequality. So inequality is a sort of indicator of how poor and unhealthy a society is in a very literal sense. And so they sort of document at huge length the ways in which inequality is related to so many other social, environmental, and health problems that we face. And so there are other non-environmental arguments, if you like, for taking this seriously. And what this suggests to me, therefore, is the need to sort of shift beyond notions of transition, which is, as I said before, about plug and play. Let's try and keep everything else as it was, but then we'll just drive slightly different vehicles, or we may put solar panels on a few roofs. But it's essentially about substituting technologies, but not political systems or values even. Whereas I think we need to be talking far more seriously about the latter. And it's clearly not just my view. We're getting this more and more now from bodies like the International Energy Agency, the UN, or as you can see from this quote from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This was from back in 2018, talking about the need for rapid, far-reaching, unprecedented changes. And they talked about the need for transformative systemic change. That's really strong language coming from a body that's often criticized for being overly conservative and cautious, and whose role essentially is to sort of summarize peer-reviewed science on climate change and update it every few years. So to actually talk about transformative systemic change is quite far-reaching for them. It's language that you might associate more with Karl Marx than with a UN body of climate scientists. So what might be entry points for a new approach, sort of taking this down a level? Where do we go from here, if you like? Let me just sort of point out a few things. I think one thing it's important to emphasize first of all is that there are cracks, there are openings, there are vulnerabilities. I think sometimes when we talk about the system or capitalism or the global economy, it seems completely overwhelming. There's so many different actors that are hugely powerful, very interrelated. Where on earth do we start? And of course, there's some truth in that type of analysis. But I guess what I'm trying to say here, drawing on this quote from Leonard Cohen, is that there are also cracks and vulnerabilities, and this is where we can start to think about how things might move forward. And for me, that's really about getting to the roots of the problem. And let me say what I mean by this. So one is clearly overproduction. Now, this slide comes from something called the Production Gap Report. And basically what it's pointing out is that there's no way on earth we're going to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement unless we leave more fossil fuels in the ground. And, astonishingly, as you probably know, it's taken 30 years of climate negotiations to actually name the number one source of the problem, fossil fuels. It was literally only at the COP last year where they talked about the need to transition away from fossil fuels. And of course, that's not a coincidence, right? It's decades and decades of really serious lobbying from fossil fuel actors to not name the severity and the scale of this problem. But what this report is showing that we cannot achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement unless we get serious about this, because governments are currently planning. This figure has actually changed now. This is 120, it's now 110, but still very depressing in terms of the volumes of fossil fuels that are planned to be extracted and burned compared with what's consistent with a 1.5 temperature goal, which is, of course, the aspirational goal of the Paris Agreement. And as I say, it's astonishing, really, that the Paris Agreement, the key climate agreements, don't even mention the main source of the problem. And for some of us, this has been a sort of drive to really shift the debate on climate change, in particular, from not just thinking about how we regulate emissions, but how we can control and limit and regulate supply. How do we agree fairly and globally what the limits on future fossil fuel production might be? It's clearly not just about supply, it's also about reducing demand. And some people talk about this in terms of cutting with both arms of the scissors, right? That clearly it is about behavior change, it is about consumption to try and put less pressure on always adding to the energy mix. This is the problem, right? Everyone's just saying to fuel future demands for consumption, we need to layer more and more energy sources into the mix to deal with this problem. Clearly, that's not possible. Renewables can get us so far, but we need massive attention to energy demand and shifts in consumption. So clearly it is both parts of the story. But what we were trying to do, and this is an initiative I've been involved with from the start, it derived from an opinion piece that Andrew Sims, who some of you may know, and I wrote back in 2018 on the need for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And essentially what happened, we were talking in the pub in 2018, and it happened to be the 50th anniversary of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And we started thinking, well, how come we don't have a treaty like this for fossil fuels? Because that treaty had three key pillars. One was around non-proliferation, i.e., don't make the problem worse, put limits on expansion. A second one was about safe use, which in this case would be about rolling back existing infrastructures. And a third, in this context, would be around a just transition, how we hardwire issues of justice into a treaty. And the treaty campaign has now taken off, and there's 13 governments that are backing this. There are, dozens and dozens of cities, trade unions, even environmental movements, indigenous movements, trying to get behind this idea of trying to sort of really reframe the climate debate around the obvious need to go for a global fair phase out of fossil fuels. So clearly overproduction is part of it, but it's also overconsumption. And again, let me just sort of flag one way of getting into this. So rather than just talking about nudging and incremental changes to behavior, again, Andrew Sims, who I just mentioned, and other colleagues of mine are involved in what they call badvertising. And you can see one example of it here, where they're trying to challenge some of the fraudulent, frankly, and greenwashing claims of many advertisers about the greenness of their projects. And many cities now have come on board to try and ban advertising in particular parts of cities in some cases, particularly around schools and hospitals and so on. But then others more broadly, like Amsterdam, has now put put down a ban on fossil fuel advertising. And so there's this growing movement to sort of say, why are we continuing to sort of advertise and promote and sell products which are incompatible with trying to address the climate crisis that we're now living through? So for me, and this is reflected in a book I wrote a few years ago, it really is about shifting power over systems of provision and production and consumption. But as I was saying before, around politics and institutions, over our economies and culture and society, it's not just this narrow, incremental, technology-focused plug and play approach. It's a deeper problem, which can sound very overwhelming. At the same time, it also opens up a whole load of possibilities about where we can start to move things forward. So lots of people talk about food sovereignty, food communities, food democracy, energy democracy, as you can see on this slide, is becoming more and more important as well. People talk a lot about prosumers, where people can generate their own energy and have control over how and where and for what it's consumed. So there's this rising tide of people, wanting to sort of recommon and claim control of some of these systems, which are crucial to our lives, but which continue to be run in such hugely unsustainable ways, whether it's energy, food, water, etc., or waste. But that does mean cleaning up politics. Going back to what I was saying before, we're about to see it again now with the next conference of the parties meeting in Azerbaijan. You will see again a record number of fossil fuel lobbyists there, sitting on delegations, trying to slow progress, questioning the science, exaggerating the costs of action. And we've seen also, as we know, in the UK, we had the Global Warming Policy Foundation, run by Nigel Lawson and others, and now reframing themselves as Net Zero Watch, and constantly feeding a stream of stories to the media around problems with heat pumps, around the problems with electric cars, around eco-fundamentalists or eco-terrorists, as they prefer to call them somehow. So there's this fundamental problem around, which voices are getting into the debate. And of course, in turn, that is a function of party donations, secondments, the revolving door that often operates where ministers will have directorships, and when they leave office, they go into the private sector, and private sector people come into government. So there's, a lot to be done there in terms of basic functioning of our democracy, in a way. But we do also need to have these very difficult debates around limits. So this is, I mentioned Kate Raworth before. Again, this is her notion of a just and safe space for humanity. So if you think back to that slide I had on planetary boundaries, this is doing the same thing, but saying, how do we create, this is what she calls donut economics, this donut in the middle, where you're meeting the needs for peace and justice, income and work, basic needs around food, water, energy, but you do so in a way that is respectful of and recognizes these key ecological thresholds. So this is the sort of thing that she's pushing forward. And again, cities like Amsterdam are adopting this on a city level, and there's a huge amount of interest in these types of ideas around really rethinking our economies. Obviously,
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
oh, someone's talking there. And what? Of course, this is very difficult to have these conversations because we're operating in an environment in which it's people don't want to talk about limits. It's almost as if there is infinite economic growth and we can carry on forever. And there's a great quote here from Kenneth Boulding, who was himself a professor of economics, but saying that anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. Or possibly both. But we are seeing this shift. I mean, it'd be interesting in your reflections, but in my lifetime, I was born in 1972 and we had the Limits to Growth report. But for a very, very long time, ideas about limits to growth were, really challenged and discredited in lots of ways. But we are seeing more and more embrace of notions of prosperity beyond growth, and the greater emphasis on well-being. We are seeing some economies like Bhutan having this national gross happiness. There are alternative indicators produced by New Economics Foundation and others talking about, well-being and planetary health, which take us beyond the very, very narrow and problematic understanding of growth that we often have to work with. And so what it's pointing to, in a way, this comes from the Just Transition Initiative that's largely led by Indigenous groups. They talk about this difference between the sort of extractive economy we have at the moment, which is very much based on, poor quality work,
Hmm.
heavy, heavily rests on militarism, very extractivist in terms of resources, towards or a new regenerative economy, which has, you know, would govern in a very different way and is much more about circular economies and regeneration. And would imply changes at all of these levels, at local, national, and international level, and that would be the sort of an entry point for a new economics. And it does, because often people say, well, it's either individual change and we start focusing again on individual behaviors and what we can do in our day-to-day lives. And of course, that is all very important, but it connects intimately, I'm trying to suggest, with these broader system changes around governance, around social transformation, around just transitions, one planet living, etc. So the two go hand in hand, because in a lot of these debates, you're either saying, well, it's all about capitalism, it's all about the global order, or it's all about whether you recycle and whether you drive an EV or how often you fly. And of course, both of these things have to be part of the picture and are intimately connected. And so I guess this is where I end up, that in a way we each have to think about what our role is in the particular and very different spaces that we occupy within our families, within our workplaces, if we're lucky to work, lucky enough to work within our communities, within any groups and movements we're part of, or political parties like the Green Party, and then beyond that. So I tend to think about it in terms of these sort of concentric circles of power and influence that each of us have. And of course, some people have way more power and scope to influence things than others. But it's sometimes a helpful way of checking in, well, what are the levers of change that I have? And it's clearly not just about what you do as a consumer. It is often, if you can bring about change in your workplace, that can have a knock-on impact depending on the size of your workplace on hundreds or potentially thousands of people. Then likewise, again, if you're part of a broader movement or political party. And I do think we need new narratives. So Andrew Sims and I some years ago set up something called the Rapid Transition Alliance. Um, and our strap line was evidence-based hope. And if you go to our website, and I would encourage you to do so, you can see lots of stories about the possibility of change, both historical examples and more contemporary ones around when things have changed around provision of water, around provision of energy, around the mobilization and redirection of finance, around how people have learned to travel differently, or whatever it might be. So we've got about 200 or so organizations worldwide that are part of the alliance, and really it's around generating and sharing and using politically these stories of change to call out inaction, basically, to say, when a government says, we couldn't possibly pedestrianize this city centre, you say, well, actually, 500 other cities have done this. Or they'll say, we couldn't possibly entirely divest from fossil fuels. We can say, well, there's 2,000 examples of cities that have done precisely that, etc. So we're just trying to surface stories around the possibility of change. And we started this initiative, when Extinction Rebellion and many other movements were on the rise, and there was a lot of sort of catastrophism in the air. And we were trying to say, whilst all of that is really important and credible, and we have to live with the scale of the challenge we're up against, we also need these stories about the possibility of change. And I think an important part of this is how we move that forward. And Rob Hopkins, who many of you all know, I'm sure, coming from Devon, talks about from what is to what if. How do we sort of shift that sense of the limits of the current imagination to think about what might come next? And I guess my final word would be to say, although some of these things sound a bit ambitious or utopian, maybe, we do need to think outside the box. And as Albert Einstein said, you can see in this final quote, that we can't solve the current problems we have by using the thinker we use to create them in the first place. So there's just a few things I've written here in case they're of interest to you. I can send links or shorter versions of them to Ricky to share with you if anyone's interested. But happy otherwise to take your questions. Thank you for your time.